I literally had to jump my eyes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Luke Niferatos. I am the Executive Vice President at SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, as well as co-founder at the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. These are our headquarters that you're at today. And I'll just tell you, this started out as, wouldn't it be great to have Danny Funt and Patrick get together and just talk at the office? And it turned into a whole C-SPAN camera thing. So thank you for bearing with us. And we've only been in the offices for about 2.5 months. So pardon our dust. We're still figuring things out, but really grateful to have this space. Grateful that you all came today. I think we're going to have a great discussion. I did want to just quickly set the table because for those of you who know us, you know that SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, was co-founded by our CEO, Dr. Kevin Sabet, former three-time White House advisor, as well as co-founded by former Congressman Patrick Kennedy. They founded our organization in 2013, right after Colorado, where I'm from, became the first state to legalize marijuana. They were worried that what was going to come from that policy was a new addiction for profit industry like big tobacco. And that's what our organization has spent a lot of time working on over the last little more than a decade. Well, 3 years ago, we started to realize that the addiction for profit plan was not going to stop with tobacco and opioids and marijuana, but it was actually going to keep going to other substances and other industries. So we founded 3 years ago with former then Biden drug czar, a number of other leaders in drug policy and addiction policy in New York City, the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. And that is now our sister organization, and that's the other logo that you see around here. That organization is now tackling broader addiction issues, broader drug issues. And it is under that umbrella of this house that we are talking today, because as many of you know, sports betting, online gambling, now prediction markets, it's a wide and rapidly growing trend that we are only just beginning to understand. When we all came together, Kevin and Patrick and myself and others, Jordan Davidson, when we all came together to build this organization, we thought about drugs as addiction drivers. We weren't thinking about technology and betting and those things, which now have become real drivers of addiction in our society. So that is the context for today. We are beginning to explore sports betting as an issue. It's something that needs to be dealt with in Congress, and we're really looking forward to joining you in listening to these esteemed panelists. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luke. I'm Marcia Lee Taylor, and I am with the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. And I'm so excited to see so many people here today for what I think will be a really interesting conversation about something that is a hot topic in the news and in a lot of people's houses as well, as they're navigating young kids and sometimes grown-ups who are grappling with sports betting. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have former Congressman Patrick Kennedy with us. He spent 8 years in the House of Representatives and really during that time became one of our nation's leading champions on mental health and addiction issues and on brain science writ large. He was the author of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which mandated for the first time ever that insurance companies had to cover treatment for behavioral health issues. And we are all very grateful for his work on that, his founding of One Mind and SAM and the Kennedy Forum. And so thank you for being with us today. And we also have Danny Funt, who is a journalist with the Washington Post. His work has also appeared in the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal. And most importantly for our discussion today, he's the author of Everybody Loses, sorry, I have to get the title right. Everybody Loses, The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. And it is a fascinating read. I think I dog-eared more pages than I didn't in the book. So I would encourage everyone to read it. It's fascinating. And it really is a history of how we got here. A history of gambling in the United States with a focus on what has happened since the Supreme Court overturned effectively a federal ban on gambling back in 2018. So with that, not everyone is an expert in sports gambling. So Danny, would you just talk a little bit about where we are today, how this problem evolved, and how big a problem it is in the United States right now?
Absolutely. First, thank you all so much for doing this. What an honor. I've been covering it, as you said, for several years before writing the book. As a sports fan, I had always assumed gambling would never be encouraged by the leagues. They spoke of it in almost biblical terms, that it was this evil that would be the deadliest thing possible. That's something the commissioner of baseball said barely a decade ago. So to see things go from that to where we are today, where it's ubiquitous, inescapable. Even if you're not betting, you can't turn on a game or listen to your favorite podcast without being bombarded with appeals to gamble. All of that was disorienting. And I felt like, as you know, in the states I've lived where legalization exploded and just across the country, we were kind of cheated out of the sort of debate you would think would be mandatory before doing something like that. That allowing people to bet on their phones on every second, on every game is so volatile or explosive. Who does this endanger? How will we protect sports from being corrupted? Will it increase addiction? All of these basic questions were brushed aside. And my hope for the book is to confront those and hopefully generate enough interest that the leagues, various politicians, all of them are, and the sports books, obviously, all of them belatedly would address that. Because it feels like so much has changed. This is still a very fresh story. So there's time to, actually reckon with all that's happening with sports and just American life.
And Patrick, you now live in New Jersey, which is the birthplace of all of this. New Jersey passed the law that originally challenged the federal ban. And you have been, as I mentioned before, a leader on addiction issues. What is your perspective on all of this, and why are you so energized about this issue?
Thanks, Marcia. And Danny, thanks, man. Congratulations on a fantastic book and a great contribution to our country, because you have done the definitive outline as to how we got here, going from, as you said, a world where this was seen as unbelievably unlikely to happen to now something that is ubiquitous, that is posing, from my vantage point, a huge danger to the public health in America. I had the honor of being the sponsor of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And in that role, I fought to make sure mental health and addiction was reimbursed by insurance companies and was treated in the same way as we would treat any other illness in our healthcare system. Of course, mental illness and addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma, none of that was considered health. It was somehow like we had separated the mind from the body in terms of coverage. We were able to, in 2008, in a bipartisan way, pass a bill that required insurance companies to cover the brain like they would any other organ of the body for any set of chronic illnesses. So here's the point. Everybody is complaining, especially post-COVID, that we have a mental health and addiction crisis in this country. Everybody in America is saying, oh my God, our kids are in an existential fight for their lives with their mental health. So they also say, we don't have enough clinicians taking care of the need that we have in America. And so I say to myself, I see these new addiction for profit companies. And I remember when my father, late Senator Edward Kennedy, fought with people like Henry Waxman against big tobacco, who, as we all recall, the CEOs came up to Capitol Hill and lied through their teeth about this not being an addictive product. And then we saw with the opioid crisis, Purdue Pharma, which had totally capitalized on their seeding the whole medical establishment with their indicator of treating pain as a primary obligation to the point where they were ignoring the downstream impact of addiction. And we all complained about Purdue Pharma. And today, we are letting the new big tobacco in marijuana, we're letting the new big kind of pharma addiction for profit industries come in like, sports betting. And we're saying to ourselves, well, we don't have enough people to help treat it. We're pouring gasoline on the fire of mental illness and addiction. And so we have politicians say, oh, we need to address mental health and addiction. At the same time, they're voting and proposing the expansion of the very industries that are putting more Americans in jeopardy for mental illness and addiction. So my vantage point from all of this is that we need to get honest and transparent in this country. Do we really care about the mental well-being of our fellow citizens, particularly our children? Because we all have complained about social media and the fact that our kids have been glued to their iPhones and their iPads. Now they've primed the brain for addiction. What do we have now? We have betting all on your phone. You know, in New Jersey, like you have, we used to have people just go to the casinos. Now they've got a casino in their pocket. And the sports betting is just the beginning of those, you know, virtual platforms for betting taking off. Now we're seeing iGaming, which is, you know, the roulette wheel on your phone. And we're seeing this predictive markets, which doesn't even get considered as gambling, which is another interesting loophole that they've jumped through. But this is a big issue right now because we're all reading about it with respect to the, you know, predictive marketing. And now I am just so thrilled that we had someone like Danny bring us through the kind of history of where we are today and how we got here.
I was really struck reading the book about the parallels with marijuana legalization. You know, here we are at the SAM headquarters. You know, we think a lot about marijuana and pushing back against the stampede across the country. In both cases, we've seen really rapid social change driven by legalization that has been followed by intense commercialization. You know, the advertising is everywhere for this, and that leads to a kind of normalization of a behavior. How do we go about reining, or can we rein any of that in so that we begin to have common sense regulations? Is that possible at this point? And what do you think the best venue for that is?
Yeah, it's interesting as you compared it to marijuana. The argument from the industry and these various politicians who supported it and the leagues who eventually became the biggest champions for legalization was that you have this robust black market that's untaxed, unregulated. Why not bring that into the sunlight for the sake of customers without actually expanding the amount of betting going on? And I think they vastly overstated the size of the black market. Of course, people have been betting on sports forever. But when Adam Silver said $400 billion were being wagered every year on sports, and you think about now a little more than 150 billion are wagered legally, the idea that double that was being bet before billions had been spent on marketing and integrating it and telecast, all that, there's good reason to think that was a ludicrous overstatement. But beyond that, so few states in practice actually pursued that idea of we're not going to grow the number of people gambling, we're just going to make it safer and something we can tax. Ohio was really in a small handful of states that seemed like that was their priority. And they immediately said these deceptive promotions, like calling a $1,000 risk-free bet to get you through the door. That was very seductive. In a lot of the country, they said that's misleading as it's fundamentally not risk-free if you can lose that $1,000. People who didn't read the fine print were pretty upset to learn that. They said other forms of advertising should be restricted. Now they're saying all these prop bets, which are essentially carving up games into thousands of betting opportunities within the game, that's out of hand. And Governor DeWine in Ohio has said this is his biggest mistake in office was legalizing sports betting. And even after all of these restrictions that are an outlier across the country, the idea that you might want it legal, but you might want to contain it through taxing and those regulations and that approach is so foreign to so many states where it's basically been let it rip and let this get as big as it can get. And I think in time, we've seen so many other parts of the world who allowed that and installed such flimsy guardrails. And then after far too long, they saw this is an addiction crisis in the making. It's corrupting sports. Rates of youth gambling are frightening. We have to crack down and have a wave of re-regulation. I think that's eventually in store in the US, but what it'll take to motivate states to realize that this is out of hand could be pretty grim.
And Patrick, I'd love your thoughts on that too. And also, because you've worked so long in the substance use field, what are the parallels for prevention and the things we need to be teaching kids in schools?
So I actually believe we need a wholesale change in our whole approach to addressing this mental health and addiction crisis in this country, where we put a premium on educating our kids how to have the tools that, frankly, as someone in recovery myself, I've been given by dint of being in recovery, where I have to learn how to self-modulate, have better coping mechanism development, problem-solving skills. I have to have skills to be able to intervene when I know there are intrusive thoughts that are counterproductive. Like, these are all things that to the average person listening to this may be kind of, what is he talking about? I'm talking about the ability to short circuit my compulsive response to triggers that would put me back out as an active user of drugs and alcohol. And so I have a coping mechanism. I go 12-step recovery. I have peers. I even have an addiction trained psychiatrist. Most mental health professionals are not trained in actual addiction treatment, ironically. So the point in all this is that in a world where more is going to be dependent on our fellow Americans' ability to have the ability to navigate a very tumultuous world coming with AI potentially dislocating over half of our country's employee base, certainly within the next 5 years, 60% reskilling of America's workforce. Can you imagine the trauma on families with the coming of AI? How are we going to manage that kind of trauma in the midst of the trauma we're living through politically in this country right now, where we're all at each other's throats if we belong to the wrong team? So we are at a point now where our kids cannot cope because they've spent so much of their time on technology. They don't have the social and emotional skills to manage their own feelings and emotions. So I would say we have to put a premium, because as we can see, education has to change in order to prepare our people to be able to work in a modern work world. And in a modern work world, if AI is doing a lot of critical thinking that used to be done by people, what is the differentiator on our success? It's the ability for us to stay focused, to be able to be creative, to be able to connect socially. Those are skills that have been depleted because of the overuse of technology. Now, not only do we have that deficit in social emotional learning, we now have these addiction for-profit industries like sports betting that are going to be further challenging the mental wherewithal that we have as a country. And at the end of the day, our capital used to be in infrastructure, roads, bridges, and the like, or technology, or now our critical infrastructure is our brains. It's going to be the brain capital is going to be what fuels the economy in a world where AI is now going to be, its advantages are going to be determined by the creativity of our population, which is not going to be possible if we are locked with hands behind our back because we have now been held hostage by addiction issues, by too much marijuana being marketed more than Starbucks. We're going to have too much, sports betting, which is going to fuel the flames of addiction and mental illness in our country. What are we thinking as a nation? If we want to be the leader economically in the world, we are destroying the leading economic driver of our country, which is our fellow Americans' ability to maximize their brains and feel like they can make critical decisions, which is all going to be compromised if they're now held hostage by things like gambling, things like marijuana. And it's really shocking to me. We come so far in having a public safety, public health perspective that we're compromising the very, wherewithal of our fellow Americans' ability. We talked all about physical fitness. Part of physical fitness is mental fitness. And that has been degraded by all of this social media, and now social media leading to the sports betting. Maybe Danny, talk a little bit about how we've primed our kids' brains, for wiring them for addiction. When I was growing up, my father used to make me put the fireplace together because he liked in the wintertime, we've had some cold weather recently, a big fire, and he said, put the kindling in first. What's the kindling, Dad? That's all the dry wood that will get this fire started. Then you can put the bigger logs on. Well, we have put the kindling on in terms of our kids' brains with respect to social media. Now we're pouring gasoline on that fire by giving them access to, this sports betting and other kind of gambling. And if they're anxious now, what can they do? They can take a gummy bear. They can drink marijuana through what they call an elixir, Fanta Aid with THC. And it's like, you could not make up a more treacherous gauntlet for kids to walk through today than what we as adults have put in the way of our own kids' development in this country.
Let's talk for a moment about the safeguards that should be in place and that some of the companies say are in place. Danny, there's a interesting story you tell in the book where you're interviewing a woman who's recently left one of the big companies that was responsible for $3 billion worth of gambling over 14 states. And you ask her, she was responsible for responsible gaming at the company. And you asked her approximately how many people were on your team. And you very kindly said, I know you've just left, so you don't need to give me an exact number, just a ballpark is great. And her response was, well, it's easy. It was just me. That seems woefully inadequate. I think anyone would say that. But I think it's a very telling story, and I'm glad you included it in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the safeguards that are in place now and what needs to be done to appropriately beef them up so we have some internal folks or internal systems that are flagging people who are going down a very dangerous path very quickly?
Yeah, well, first of all, my jaw was just on the floor when I heard that. This was a company called PointsBet that was since acquired by Fanatics. It's one of the kind of second-tier operators, and they're growing pretty quickly. And I had just been hearing again and again all these assurances from people who'd worked at PointsBet. So someone in marketing would say, oh, if a commercial seemed like we wanted the responsible gambling department to take a look at that, we would run it by RG. RG is the acronym they use. Or with this whole sector of the business that caters to so-called VIP customers, people who are losing a staggering amount of money. There's a lot of dicey things that go on with that, of egging on people who might be going overboard. And they all said, no, if someone is displaying signs of a problem, we have RG step in or run it by RG. So run it by RG was just echoing in my head. And I expected this army of people at a company that big to be dealing with all that responsibility. And as you said, it was one person for years. Even at the companies that have more robust RG departments, and I think I sort of squirm even saying RG. I think it's such a euphemism, and it kind of brushes away the seriousness of what's at stake with that. But hearing from people at high-ranking jobs in those departments at some of the top sports books saying, we sometimes feel like our hands are tied behind our back because, as one of them put it, anything beyond the lowest common denominator of consumer protections that the industry is enacting, anything beyond that is seen as a competitive disadvantage where we're just going to lose customers or push our most valuable customers to our competitors if we are looking out for them beyond the bare minimum. So that I find so alarming. Honestly, even the reluctance to call this gambling, as absurd as that might sound. Senator Richard Blumenthal has been very vocal about this. He, like a lot of people, were bothered when it came to light that a lot of these operators were striking deals with colleges to market to college students, and whether they're of age or not, that just seems probably inappropriate. And I remember he sent me the letters that they all sent in reply, and DraftKings made almost 50 references to responsible gaming and problem gaming and our gaming and all that, and not one mention of the word gambling. And if we're not going to call this gambling, how serious could we really be about the dangers that come with gambling? The bright side, I guess, as you were getting at, is there's a lot of reforms that could be done, and a lot of other places in the world that do so much more than the US, because, as I said, they've realized entrusting the industry to self-police is inadequate. I was recently talking with someone who wanted me on their podcast in Austria, and I'm trying to sell every book I can. So I said, absolutely, let's do it. And he's a researcher there and has done some work with operators in Europe. And he was just explaining across Europe, it's an expectation that operators have to have the technology in place so that, one of the upsides of online gambling is you have all this customer data. You could exploit that in some pretty nefarious ways, but you could also use it to identify signs of a problem. And there's an onus on those companies in Europe to use that data to intervene if some red flags. Yeah. And by and large, that responsibility isn't the expectation in the US. So we could go on for a long time, but
Danny,
there's a lot like that.
Like I live near Atlantic City in New Jersey, and you had to go to the casino. Okay. And when you're in the casino, they got the eyes in the sky, all the cameras looking at you, how much you drinking, how much you betting, everything else. With this now being a virtual world where it's all digital, it's in your pocket, it's on your computer, it's on your phone, that this is fundamentally a whole different issue, right? You have no one screening for people under 21. You have no one, checking your ID. Explain a little bit, because we have this outdated, just like with marijuana. Everyone's like, oh, you're smoking marijuana, it's 2%. Today, marijuana concentrate and THC is 10 times what it was 20 years ago. And no one who's thinking about marijuana policy understands that. They also don't understand that you're drinking marijuana, essentially drinking THC, or eating marijuana, which is in the foods. So what I'm saying is, like, part of our job at SAM is just to try to reframe for people, this is not the issue you thought it was. So years ago, the issue was gambling. You had bookies, you had casinos and all the rest. This is like gambling on crack. This is your phone is your casino. So talk a little bit about the change in the fundamental nature of gambling.
Yeah, and by the way, I should say that at least to open one of these accounts, you do have to give your social security number and scan your ID. And there's a lot of things to make sure that the people signing up are of age, whether that's 18 or 21 in most states. But then how hard is it to get your older brother or your neighbor or the upperclassman at your college or your parent? I was doing an interview on WNYC just last week, and they opened the phone lines to listeners to call in. And the first guy calls in, I'm thinking, it's going to be someone who's saying, I don't like gambling, or there's too many ads or whatever. And he says, I'm the father of a son who started betting at 17, and in a few years since then has racked up $200,000 in losses. And it's gotten so bad, and my wife and I can't get through to him that he has a problem and needs help. And as a result, we're estranged from our child. And the idea that a 17-year-old would be starting to bet at that level, and it would be so ruinous for him and his family, sadly, it's not that unique of a story. The rates of gambling in, you forget college, which is out of control, but high school, middle school, even elementary school is, I think, really what might be the thing that motivates lawmakers and regulators to say we must do more here.
In terms of the addictive nature, I think you were getting to this a little bit, Patrick. Some of the design features, I think you called it the slot machine effect, that it sort of prime the same pathways in the brain and release dopamine, and it's the sort of the constant challenge and the inability to walk away. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that is really taking what was happening in the casinos in Atlantic City just to a wild new level.
Let me just add
Yeah.
on that. So you used to have to walk in the casino. Now, New Jersey passed iGaming, which is now you can do it all at the casino in your phone. And rates of addiction have doubled in New Jersey. So that's a differentiator between the former rates, which were people who were having gambling addiction in the casinos. Now that's over doubled because New Jersey passed this iGaming. By the way, Virginia right now has an iGaming bill that could get signed by the governor, and anyone watching ought to call Governor Spanberger and ask her to veto any legislation expanding gambling to iGaming, and that's within the next month. So if you're watching and you're from Virginia, please call your legislators and tell them you don't want to add more fuel to this epidemic of online addiction.
There's so many areas of this where, to me, the most striking takeaway from my book is hearing from people in the industry who are saying things are out of control and we can't believe how this business is evolving. And particularly hearing someone who used to work at FanDuel, the top online sportsbook in the country, say online casino, what you were just describing, is our most ethically problematic product, just because all of these issues are so magnified when you're playing blackjack, slots, roulette, you name it, from your phone. There was one executive who stands out of just being kind of shockingly candid about the way that these products are engineered to take advantage of people and get them to overdo it. He was a vendor that provides these so-called micro bets, like betting on, will the next pitch be a ball or a strike? Will this possession in a football game end in a touchdown or a punt? All of that is a big growth area for the business because the idea that you're betting on a minute by minute as opposed to hour by hour basis is potentially really profitable. And I said, gosh, I've heard from so many health experts that betting in that frenzied pace is a road toward compulsive behavior. Just naturally, it's almost like being in a vortex of just banging away how quickly you could overdo it. On a financial side, I said, I'd imagine, let's say someone's comfortable betting $50 pregame. If they're betting $10 10 times over the course of the game, they're going to look up and say, wow, I've bet twice as much as I intended. And he said, yeah, that's the goal. Yeah. And then I said, what about this compulsive behavior concern? And he interjected and said, sticky. Sticky is how we'd like to think of it, that it's especially sticky. Yeah. But what it's a euphemism. Obviously, it's just a softer word for compulsion.
Again, going back to the drug parallel, it seems to me in drug policy, we talk about route of administration and how a pill doesn't hit your system as quickly as something taken intravenously. And it seems like this is the IV sort of example of gambling.
Talk a little bit about the suicide risks, because one thing that people in our community, in the mental health world, are very focused on is the increase in suicide in America and the prevalence. And I have heard, just anecdotally, that suicide goes up dramatically, suicide ideations and completed suicide because of sports betting and gambling addiction. Now, as a person recovering myself, I remember, having car accidents, having court dates, being arrested, having all kinds of consequences that got me into recovery. What happens with sports betting is it's insidious because people can bet, and they don't necessarily have all the jackpots that people who have the old-fashioned drug addiction have, where they get lots of warnings and stop signs like, don't do this, you're going down a wrong road. And it can be something that catches up with you all of a sudden when you realize you've just gambled away all your student loans. You've just gambled away your kids' tuition. You've just lied to your spouse and gambled away the mortgage. You've just stolen and embezzled money, and now you're looking at jail. Like, these are cataclysmic, jackpots. And they frankly make the jackpots that people like me with old-fashioned drug and alcohol addiction look tame in comparison, which is why I think the level of what we call pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization, that's how we describe it in recovery, that moment of clarity where we say we can't go on, is kind of like comes too late for people with sports betting and gambling addiction. And when it comes, it's at a magnitude greater than when it comes to people who have quote unquote old-fashioned alcoholism and addiction. But could you talk a little bit about the suicide ideation?
There's so many distinct qualities of gambling addiction in general that are so dangerous. For one, as you said, the suicidal ideation rate, the exact number, I've seen some debate around that, but I think a lot of people believe it has the highest rate of suicidal ideation among addictions. The fact that it's an invisible addiction is so dangerous. You know, as people say, you can't smell gambling on someone's breath. You don't see marks on their arms where they've been shooting up. This might sound naive of me, but I was just blown away speaking with people with devastating gambling addictions for years, you know, betting at every minute they could find, and their spouse had no idea. And that's just horrifying. And the other side of it is that it's what's referred to as a progressive disorder, where it can take years for a problem to take shape. I spoke with a lot of people who said, I was betting on sports, I was fine. And actually, when I finally got that big win, that was my curse, because I spent every subsequent day chasing not just that money, but that feeling. And obviously they ended up losing way more money. And this is much bigger than money, but that was a part of it. So I'm no expert, but just speaking with as many people as I could who are in recovery for gambling problems, they've said gambling addiction tends to coincide with other substance abuse, and people who've dealt with multiple addictions say gambling can be the hardest one to overcome. And just lastly, one reason for that you were touching on is probably only with gambling do you think that your problem is your solution. You convince yourself that if I could just win enough money to get out of this hole, everything will be better. And that can get really out of control.
One more question before we open it up to the audience. I hope people in the audience have some good questions to pose. A lot of states, when they pass legislation to legalize gambling, they said, we're going to take some of the revenue and we're going to invest it into treatment. We're going to invest it into prevention. And again, parallels with marijuana, a lot of promises made, not a lot of promises kept. What can we do to make sure that there is more responsibility on the state level and that there are more resources for people who do wind up down this very dangerous spiral?
Yeah, first of all, we were all sold that this is going to be a big revenue generator for states. It's why we bought legalization of marijuana. It's why we've bought, gambling. It's because it's a quick fix for state budgets. This idea that you get more revenue without having to do the tough stuff, which is raise taxes. The problem is it's not for free. And anything that glitters isn't always gold. And the true cost of gambling addiction and commercialization of marijuana is going to overwhelm in terms of societal cost and cost to state budgets compared to the revenue that they're bringing in from sports betting and gambling. So maybe, Danny, talk a little bit about that, because I don't think in our movement as advocates, we've done a good enough job putting the price tag so that legislators like my former colleagues know that it really isn't a windfall of free money. They're going to end up spending more money on all kinds of human social services, criminal justice costs, and of course, the terrible tragedy of broken families and the impact on real people and their whole lives. So, and of course, the business community probably hasn't truly factored in what this is doing to productivity in our country and ability for workers to pay attention when they're at work to what they're supposed to be doing. So talk a little bit about that.
One side of this that I think is so essential and so revealing is whenever we talk about, how many people are gambling now or how many people have gambling problems, these are really educated guesses because there hasn't been, as remarkable as this is, there hasn't been a federal study of the prevalence of gambling since 1999. And a few years ago, there's been a federal excise tax on sports betting since I think the 40s or 50s. It's been around forever, even when it was confined to Nevada, but definitely now. And a few members of Congress said, the money just goes to the general funds. Why not divert, I think it was half of it, toward research so we have a better handle of questions as basic as how much gambling is going on and how many people have problems. And also some of that could go toward treatment and prevention. And the industry just posed this incredibly aggressive fight to stop that, saying, this is unnecessary, we already researched that, blah, blah, blah. I just find it so revealing, again, that the idea of just trying to have a clearer sense of how much gambling is going on is such a threat to the industry. And as Keith White, the longtime director of the National Council on Problem Gambling, I quote him in my book saying, they want to count the revenue, they don't want to count the bodies. And a lot of people echoed that if we actually knew the damage this is doing and this surge of addiction and other health problems across the country, the industry would face so much more scrutiny.
And of course, this whole issue of prediction markets isn't even considered gambling. So they get out from underneath in a huge loophole the idea that they ought to be regulated like gambling companies. And it's probably the risk is higher for this prediction market business than even sports betting. Wouldn't you say?
Could be. I mean, it's exploded in the past year, so I don't want to speculate, too much.
That's my job.
Right.
And of course, it's based on very little than my intuition, which could get you in trouble. But I think anybody watching this, common sense tells you this is deadly. And now we got Wall Street Journal, CNN. People are going to be betting on what's the next story. It's going to not only corrupt sports. It's going to corrupt our culture. It's going to corrupt our news. This has got a corrosive impact, not only on our public health and the mental health of our young people, but for our country on so many levels. So glad so many of you are here. I know many of you may have some questions to add to this. So I think that's where we'll move to right now.
Oh, yeah, we're streaming here. So. Okay.
Thank you. Lifelong Cleveland Guardians, Indians and Guardians fan. So we're watching Emmanuel Clase and Luis Ortiz, who were both facing 65 years in jail. My question is, how much of the sports gambling issue would be curtailed if you could only bet on who wins and who loses? You can't do is this pitch a ball or a strike? You can't do is she going to hit the high note in the national anthem? You can't bet literally on everything. You can only place a bet on who wins and who loses.
I think going to that level might be a bit extreme, but you could definitely rein in bets on will the next pitch be a ball or a strike, or will, a bench player get a certain number of rebounds in the first quarter of a basketball game. I mentioned earlier that the industry uses the black market as a boogeyman oftentimes to say, well, they don't have these restrictions, and why should we? We're in competition with the black market. Senator Blumenthal described that as a race to the bottom. I think that's an apt description. But in this case in particular, I ran that idea by certain experts in the betting industry after Clase and his teammate were arrested for fixing pitches. And I said, the industry argues that if we restricted those types of bets, customers would just run to offshore operators or street bookies and nothing would actually be solved. And I was asking this to someone who works in what's called integrity monitoring, this big business of preventing improper betting and the corruption of sports, the companies that were supposedly entrusted to stop that sort of thing from happening. And I don't know that I can use the word on C-SPAN to quote him exactly, but he just said, essentially that's nonsense. That, yeah, there are some determined bettors who will go to the black market anyway. That's why it's still thriving. But a lot of ordinary people who are comfortable downloading an app from the App Store and then using Venmo and PayPal to deposit their money are not going to go to some sketchy offshore website and bet with crypto just so they can bet on those sorts of frivolous props. So yeah, I think there's some real logic to that to some extent.
Hi there. My name is Tim Gagline. I'm a lobbyist here for Off-Hill Strategies, and Smart Approaches to Marijuana is one of our clients. So it's a real honor to be able to work for and with them. Congressman and Danny, thank you so much for your time today. I have two questions that I hope intersect, and I'll be as concise as I can be. The first question I have, building a little bit off Luke Alby's question here, has to do with the state of organized crime in the United States. And I look forward to reading the book, and I don't know if you address this in the book, so forgive me. But, you know, of course, there was the major FBI sting that happened in October where I think 31, 32, or 33, somewhere in there, current and former NBA players and coaches as well, Chauncey Billups of the Trailblazers, were caught in this sports gambling scheme with organized crime. And so I guess the first question, and I'll go into my second just right after, which is just to what extent has the explosion, the normalization of online sports gambling helped, hurt, or what is its been relationship to the mob? Has it really been a boon for organized crime in America? And I guess the second question is related to that. A little over a month ago, it was the first pay-per-view of the United Fighting Championships, or the UFC. There was a fight scheduled on the undercard as a featherweight bout between two fighters. At the last moment, the fight was pulled. And the reason that Dana White, president and CEO of the UFC, pulled it is he said that there was an unusual amount of sports gambling activity right before leading up to the fight, suggesting perhaps a fighter was injured and had not been disclosed, and bettors knew about it, and that's what happened. Obviously, President Trump is very close to Dana White. Is it your sense that President Trump, that this is on his radar at all? I know in theory he remains opposed to legalization of marijuana, even though he rescheduled marijuana in late 2025, which is a massive deregulation for it. I guess my question is, to what extent is it on his radar, and are you hopeful at all that it will be and that he'll want to do something about it?
Let me quickly say that the mob used to make their money on gambling and drugs. Now the states make their money on gambling and drugs. If you want to make the case, is the mob growing? It depends on how you define the mob. Because now organized crime is not Raymond Patriarca in Rhode Island. Organized crime are the states that have decided to put their citizens at risk by making the access to both drugs and gambling and this other digital addiction ubiquitous to their people. And not my sense is they are foregoing their trust responsibility to protect the welfare and well-being of their constituents by essentially monetizing the destruction which will come from. Tell about like the percentage of gamblers and the revenue that's generated by a small percentage, because I think that tells the real story, that this is really about exploiting addiction. This is not about some Sunday afternoon joint in the case of marijuana. It's not some Sunday afternoon bet on a sports. This is now, we've got heavy day-to-day users for marijuana has passed that of alcohol. Heavy users. More heavy marijuana users than alcohol users in America. And it would seem to me, and what are they doing? They're making their money when they say, drink responsibly. No, they don't make their money off of drinking responsibly. They make their money off of people like me that drank irresponsibly. We're the ones who have addiction that are driving the profit of these addiction for profits. And I imagine in sports betting, it's the same way. You have a very small percentage of the betting population with addiction who are generating a big percentage of the profits for those companies.
Yeah, the number I've heard is 1% of customers account for half of revenue. Some of them obviously are ultra wealthy people who just are betting at a whole other level. Some of them aren't. And I mentioned, one of those jaw droppers was the fact that this company had one responsible gaming official. Another was there's this whole chapter devoted to VIP customers, the people who are losing at that rate, and the unbelievable perks and white glove treatment that they get from these companies to keep them losing at that level. And I had heard one reassurance after another from the operators that they vet those customers to make sure they can afford to be losing that amount of money. And you might say, you could have a gambling problem even if you can afford to be losing all that money, but that's another point. But at least they claim they are checking that people have the means to bet at that level. And I was speaking with someone who lost 100 grand at FanDuel in a year. And I was just, again, in the back of my head, remembering all the times I've been told that they would make sure someone like that could afford to lose that. So I said, what were you doing to earn a living when you lost all that money at FanDuel? And he said, I was a server at the Cheesecake Factory making 65 grand a year. And obviously he claims FanDuel never made any effort to confirm that with him. To your question about the mob, the thing that came to mind for me is there's so much more opportunity to corrupt sports now because you can bet on so many different things, and inside information is so valuable, and the opportunity to get that from people, to extort them so that they'll give that up. When we're under this large health umbrella of what's happening with gambling, that's a piece of it too. The danger that it presents to athletes, coaches, anyone who works in sports is now facing unbelievable levels of harassment and threats from gamblers and pressure from people who want them to do something to help them win money. So that's a big piece of the story too.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Two more questions.
Two more questions?
Connor and I. Great.
Yeah, thank you both. Connor Semmelsberger with the Heritage Foundation. Representative Kennedy, what struck me is what you talked about, the AI race changing and displacing people at work. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, coal mines and steel mills. So we saw our industries left, and then we were ravaged by the opioid crisis right after that. And so, but what struck me, tying this back to sports betting, how quickly they move into a community that's already, many of these communities already suffering, is I was home over Christmas visiting family, and every small town where I grew up has a Catholic church, a Sheetz gas station, and a Dollar General. But now I can add two more things to those lists: a vape shop. And what surprised me is even just our locally owned grocery stores in the back are gambling machines. Just, you want to go to the local grocery store, these communities, elderly populations already ravaging. So could you add further commentary? I thought that's very interesting, that just these same communities that have been hit by the economic woes lead to these addictions, and it's drugs, as we've seen in the past, but now it's gambling, both the young generation online sports betting, but then also just those that have very little money being extorted to just, you're picking up food at your grocery store. Why don't you throw a couple of bets down while you're waiting in line before you check out the grocery store?
The interesting thing is, this is like, especially with this prediction market, it's being marketed as a financial strategy. Betting is the way you make money, has actually become commonplace in terms of our understanding. So you even have payday loan vendors, you have these major credit card companies, banks getting into this business because they're going to make profit off of getting people more in hock to pay the higher interest rates and bills as a result of this. So there's unseemly partnerships between the financial sector and the gambling sector. But the total impact on the financial wherewithal of Americans would be something I'd be really interested in knowing. I'd like to know how much the relative personal debt that Americans are going to carry after the onset of this sports betting. Who is tracking that? Who is tracking the bankruptcies? Who's tracking all the costs the government's going to be paying out in order to help repair the damage that's going to be left in the wake of these companies? But Danny, I know you could talk a little bit about.
There's been very compelling studies. I wish I'd remembered the universities offhand to give them their credit, but comparing states with legal sports betting and those without it. And they have demonstrated that where it's legal, there's higher bankruptcy rates, lower credit scores, less household savings, even higher instances of domestic violence in states with legal sports betting. Now, the Potentially prediction markets will be in all 50 states, and maybe it'll render those distinctions moot. But at least for now, you can see that clear disparity.
Maggie Keneally with Concerned Women for America. Thank you so much for this. I think this is one of the most insidious problems we're facing today that's flying completely under the radar. So perhaps to turn the conversation to what can we as DC people do? To my knowledge, the only good thing that Congress has done on this in the past few years was a provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill that curbed the amount of deductions that gamblers can take off of their winnings. Are there any other live legislative solutions in Congress right now? And if not, what would you like to see done at the federal level on this?
Well, I honestly, we have to come to a general moral understanding of whether we believe it's in our nation's best interest to have all this addiction for profit that's going to kill our people's ability to manage their own mental health in a world that's going to demand them their own mental health be at a premium to manage all the toxic stresses that everybody is living through today. So I think we need to, before we dive into the red flag opportunities, the advertising, the ubiquitous nature of advertising, the types of bets, all of the kind of regulation that can get into this, we have to first come to an appreciation. This is a problem. Like you said through your question, it's under the radar. Thanks to Danny and his book, Everybody Loses. We have to get the message across. Everybody loses. The people, their families, and this country. Employers and taxpayers. Everybody loses. And until we grasp that, we're not going to have clarity on what the solution is. Because, keep in mind, we never thought we could get where we got with tobacco. We never thought even today we get where we got with, alcohol, where they're advertising zero alcohol in major alcohol ads. You're like, this is quite a difference. Now, they've all moved towards marijuana, which is another issue, which is why this thing keeps popping up. But we have to have appreciation that there are moneyed interests whose interest is to addict people in America. And we have no public health strategy to counteract the amount of money that these gambling companies and big marijuana companies are spending to addict our fellow Americans. And whatever solutions we come up with, we're up against a monolith of money to try to manage in a countervailing way that amount of spend. You're a advocate, a lobbyist on the Hill. Can you imagine who they can hire, how many people they can hire, an army to put loopholes in any effort that Congress makes to manage this? It's going to be, that's why we need a public reckoning with these issues. And Smart Approaches to Marijuana has been a big champion of mobilizing advocacy and now more so now on the sports betting side as well.
Well, I think that's a terrific note to end on. And thank you both for a really interesting conversation. And I encourage everyone to read the book. We have copies up here. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you all for coming. It was an amazing panel, Danny. Thank you again, Patrick and Marcia. It was wonderful. Two quick things I wanted to just throw out there. First of all, we do want to acknowledge Senator Bill Bradley, the former senator and NBA star who did a lot of great work on these gambling issues during his time. So we definitely wanted to acknowledge his work. Second thing I want to mention is the discussion of legislation. So the Safe Bet Act is legislation that's been introduced in the House and the Senate. That is legislation we are absolutely supporting, and that's one step forward in beginning to deal with these problems. So thank you all very much, and please grab a book. They're free. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to see you as always.